Hi, I'm Professor Green, and we're going to continue now with part two of chapter one. So, before we hop into this next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about fiduciary. So, you'll notice that fiduciary, before I get to the slide, is all about a person who exercises power on behalf of another person or on the behalf of a firm, right? So, managers, board of directors all have fiduciary power. That'll be another key word that we'll use throughout the semester. And what I thought was interesting in the book, they differentiate between American and European organizations. So in the U.S., that the board of directors is kind of just up to mostly the organization who they want to include. But in certain countries in Northern Europe, like Germany, Norway, Austria, etc., the government requires that the board of directors has somebody from the community or from a local interest group be a part of the board of directors. So they also have then fiduciary power. And I thought that was super interesting to note that's different, that we think that here in the US, we have a lot of involvement from interest groups and from unions and political people. But actually, in Europe, the government takes it a step further and they require that most boards have a member from one of these major interest groups on each organization. Good. So let's go ahead and hop now into slide number 11. We've already gone through a handful of slides here. We're going to talk about stakeholders. So stakeholders are persons or groups that affect or are affected by a firm's decisions, policies, and operations. A stake is an interest in or claim on a business. A stakeholder is not the same as a stockholder or a shareholder. So just to differentiate, for anybody who's maybe not a native English speaker, these terms and these names can sound quite similar. So we just want to make sure that for most of the semester, we'll be talking about a stakeholder, not a stockholder or a shareholder. Shareholders are just one of several kinds of stakeholders, right? And the number of stakeholders and the variety of their interests can be large, right? So we talked about the Amazon example, that they have so many stakeholders, right? Their employees, their vendors, their suppliers, their delivery people, right? So that the stakeholder group, it can be quite significant. Let's go ahead and hop into the next slide. So there are two major types of stakeholders, market and non-market. The first one are market stakeholders. These are shareholders, suppliers, employees. They engage in economic transactions with the company as it carries out its primary purpose of providing society with goods and services. And then we also have non-market stakeholders. So these are communities, governments, business support groups, people groups who, although they do not engage directly with an economic exchange with the firm, are affected by or can affect its actions. So we'll talk a lot about non-market stakeholders in this course. And the first example that they gave in the book, right, it was from Cape Cod, about that wind energy company that wanted to put up like 130 wind engines, and the people of Cape Cod thought that it would obstruct their view and take over too much land, and they had all these complaints about this. So it took like 15 years or so, and finally the company was defeated, and they decided they wouldn't pursue or moving forward with the wind energy project. So the non-market stakeholder there was this organization called Save Our Sound. It was an interest group, right? So again, talking about these keywords. So the Save Our Sound was able to help lobby and convince the local government regulations not to allow this wind energy group to develop their area. Good. So now internal stakeholders are employed by the firm, external stakeholders are not. So internal stakeholders are employees and managers. They work inside the firm and can contribute their effort and skill to everyday operations. And then external stakeholders are suppliers, society in general, government, creditors, state shareholders, customers. And they may have important transactions with the firm, but they're not on its actual payroll. And just to talk about here, the government actually is a little bit of a tricky thing, in that we'll discuss it further this semester, that It fills many different roles, right? First and foremost, most organizations pay taxes, right? So the government's involved in receiving money from these organizations. But then also sometimes the government creates regulations for the organization, that they can't build in a certain area, they can't create a certain product. And also sometimes the government is an owner in the organization. That doesn't happen very often here in the US, but it did happen quite decently recently. In 2008, the government had to come in and take over ownership of a handful of different banks when we had the economic crisis in 2008. So just be aware that as the semester goes on, we will talk about this ever-changing role of the government. So now we have a little map of a firm and its stakeholders, right? And so we have a business firm, and then again, the governments going back and forth, non-government organizations, employees, customers, creditors, as I mentioned earlier in part one, that an organization will borrow from banks and take out loans. Then we have our shareholders and of course our competitors as well. So they also work then with all of these stakeholders. Good, let's hop on to the next slide. Oh, before I move on, I just want to talk about also the role set. So a lot of the times one of these stakeholders will have multiple roles as well, right? So to make this even a little more complicated, that an employee, they can contribute to the firm, right, with their skills and talents. They might live in the community, so they might be affected by emissions or a school that the organization might have on campus. An employee also might invest in the 401k, and so as the company makes money, they might get money back in their retirement account. And also the employee might buy products from this company occasionally. So again, it's a back and forth, and that certain stakeholders might have multiple roles, and that's called a role set. So let's talk about the stakeholder analysis. We talk about the stakeholder analysis from the focal organization. And again, another keyword. This is the organization where we're taking this analysis from their particular perspective. So this includes the identification of relevant stakeholders and analysis of their interests and power. And we're going to go through these 4 questions in the next few slides. The first one is, who are the relevant stakeholders? So we can go ahead and draw a market and non-market stakeholder maps, just like we saw a few slides ago, recognizing that not all groups are relevant to every situation, right? So some businesses sell directly to the public and will not have retailers, or a certain stakeholder may not be relevant to a particular decision or action. So it's really, really specific to your particular situation. And so the next question is, what are the interests of each of those stakeholders? So now we're going to create a little chart, right? What are the group's concerns? What does the group want or expect from the relationship with the firm? Here's some examples. Shareholders have an ownership interest. They expect to receive dividends, right, and capital appreciation. Customers are interested in gaining fair value and quality in goods and services they purchase. And public interest groups, okay, here we go again, interest groups, advance broad social interests. What is the power of each stakeholder? So they have 5 major types of stakeholder power, and that's going to be explained here on the next slide. So voting power. So if any of you hold stock, you might notice that you get things in the mail or by email these days with the opportunity to vote. So if I own stock in IBM, every couple of months they will have a vote on the board of directors or on an initiative. And as a shareholder, I have the opportunity to vote yes or no on this particular issue. Economic power. So this is where we talk about the ability to grant or withhold transactions with the focal company, right? And so again, this is for suppliers, customers, or employees, right? That suppliers, they can sell product to an organization, to a focal organization or not. Customers can buy a product or not. And employees can also be part of unions, and they can then negotiate salary and benefits and a whole bunch of different things. So that's all included in economic power. Then we have political power, actions taken through legislation, regulations, or lawsuits. And then that bridges into legal power. So this is where lawsuits filed against the focal company for harm caused by the firm. And lastly, we have informational power, having access to valuable data, facts, or details. And I really like the example that they gave in the book about Yelp, right? So we as consumers have a lot of power over businesses, mostly small businesses, right, that are on Yelp. So if we don't like a particular restaurant, we can give them just a 1-star review, and then their total average rating goes down very, very quickly. And as we've seen in real life experiences and also in the book, that if a restaurant moves from a 4 to a 3-star, it really, really changes their business. So we as consumers have a lot of informational power when it comes to restaurants or lots of different businesses, but restaurants in particular. How are stakeholder coalitions likely to form? Stakeholder groups often have common interests and will form temporary alliances to pursue these common interests, right? And so we're going to talk about the example again in the book, because I like their examples, are about farm workers, that the farm workers might be against pesticides, but so will the people who buy the products from the farms and maybe the neighboring community, because the pesticides go into the water. So coalitions, if you think about that example, you can also think that like coalitions are very dynamic, right? They can change at any time. Maybe the farm workers might say, okay, I'm going to work with these pesticides because the economy is not good and I really need a job, right? So now no longer they are a coalition. Coalitions are increasingly international, and the internet has enabled coalitions to form quickly across political boundaries. Great, so this ends our part 2 from chapter 1. Again, I'm Professor Green, and I'm excited to share with you chapter 2. The third section of chapter 1.